In the world of shifters, a she-wolf's worth is measured by the mate who claims her. For 5 years, Audrey has stood before her pack, praying for a name to be called. Her name. For 5 years, she has been met with only silence. Tonight is the final ceremony, her last chance to secure a place in a world that values strength and connection above all else. To be unclaimed is to be less than nothing, a ghost in your own pack, a shame to your bloodline. But when the final silence falls, it is not an end. It is a catalyst. Rejection will drive her into the unforgiving wilderness and into the path of a feared alpha king who sees the fire behind the shame and whose claim will ignite a war. Chapter 1. The Fifth Silence. It was the night of the claiming, and the scent of pine, earth, and anticipation was thick enough to taste. For Audrey, it was a familiar poison. She stood near the edge of the pack, her hands clenched. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the hollow emptiness in her stomach. She told herself not to hope. Hope was a cruel, sharp-toothed thing that had bitten her 4 times before. Alpha Marcus stood upon a flat-topped granite boulder, his voice a low rumble that carried to every corner of the clearing. One by one, he called the names of the unmated males. Each stepped forward, eyes scanning the crowd of females before calling out his choice. With every pairing, a ripple of joy went through the pack, a proud nod from a father, a tearful embrace from a mother, a possessive growl from the male beside his new mate. Each celebration was a fresh splinter of ice in Audrey's veins. She kept her gaze fixed on the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, counting them. She could feel her family's presence behind her, a tangible pressure on her back. She didn't need to look to know her father's rigid posture, or her mother's hands clasped in a prayer that Audrey knew was for the family's honor, not her own happiness. The shame was already a living thing, coiled in her gut. Finally, only one name remained. Kalen, a strong warrior with a kind smile, stepped forward. His eyes swept the crowd, and, for a heart-stopping second, they seemed to linger on her. Hope, that treacherous creature, unfurled its wings. Please, she thought, a silent scream to the moon. Not again. Kalen's gaze moved on, settling on a pretty she-wolf named Lyra. Lyra, he called, his voice certain. The pack erupted in cheer as Lyra, beaming, joined him. And then there was only Audrey. Alpha Marcus scanned the clearing, his expression hardening. Audrey, he called, his voice flat, a mere formality. He waited. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. The cheering died, replaced by a profound, heavy silence that pressed in on her from all sides. It was thicker than the celebratory murmurs, colder than the night air. It was the sound of rejection, absolute and final. The fifth silence. She risked a glance at her family. Her father's eyes were fixed on the alpha, his jaw a line of granite. Her mother simply closed her eyes, a flicker of pain, or was it fury, crossing her face before it was gone. The silence was their verdict, and it had declared her worthless. Chapter 2. The Weight of Shame. The walk back to the dens was a trial of 1,000 cuts. The path, usually filled with laughter and cheerful chatter after a claiming, was now a corridor of whispers and averted eyes. Pack members who had known her since she was a pup now found the dirt path fascinating, their gazes refusing to meet hers. They parted before her, creating a wide, isolating berth, as if her shame were a contagious disease. Audrey kept her chin up, her spine ramrod straight, focusing on the rhythmic sound of her own footsteps. Each step was an act of defiance against the crushing weight of their pity and scorn. The silence from her family, who walked stiffly behind her, was the most damning sound of all. The moment the thick leather flap of their den fell shut, the silence shattered. 5 times, her father, Gregor, snarled. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp and brittle with rage. 5 years we have endured this humiliation. Do you have any idea what this does to our standing? To my position as beta? He didn't look at her, instead pacing the small main chamber like a caged predator. "They're laughing at us, Elspeth," he said, rounding on her mother. "The bloodline of a beta, and she can't even secure a mate. Not one." Her mother, Elspeth, stood by the hearth, her face pale and drawn. "What would you have me do, Gregor? I have taught her everything. I have done my duty." Her eyes finally flickered to Audrey, cold and assessing. "Some seeds are simply barren." The words struck Audrey with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Barren. Useless. That was what she was to them. "She is a blight on this family," Gregor continued, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "A constant reminder of failure. I cannot have her here, under my roof, tainting my name any longer." He stopped his pacing and finally looked directly at her. There was no love in his eyes, no flicker of paternal warmth, only a cold, hard finality. "You will be gone by sunrise. I don't care where you go. Find some remote corner of the territory to hide your shame, but you will not be seen in this den again. You are no longer our concern." Audrey stood frozen, the walls of her home seeming to close in around her. Her mother simply turned her back, beginning to bank the fire for the night as if her daughter's life had not just been irrevocably destroyed. There would be no comfort, no defense. She was utterly alone. The command was absolute, the rejection complete. In the heart of her own family, she had been declared an outcast. The pain was a physical thing, a shard of ice piercing her heart. But beneath it, something else stirred. A spark of fury. Fine. If they wanted her gone, she would go. Chapter 3. Flight into Shadow. Audrey didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her cot in the small alcove that had been her room for her entire life, listening to the strained silence of the den. The air was thick with resentment. Every creak of the wood, every sigh from her parents' chamber, was a fresh twist of the knife. She moved with the quiet efficiency of a wraith, her mind numb, her body on autopilot. There was no room for tears, not yet. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Right now, there was only survival. She pulled a small, worn leather satchel from beneath her cot. Her hands moved mechanically, gathering the few possessions that were truly hers. A change of clothes, a small water skin, the sharp hunting knife her grandfather had given her before he'd passed, a time when she'd still felt the warmth of family pride. She paused, her hand hovering over a small carved wooden wolf, a gift from her father on her 10th birthday. A bitter smile touched her lips. She left it behind, a relic of a love that no longer existed. Lastly, she wrapped a hunk of dried meat and a piece of hard bread in a cloth and shoved it deep into the bag. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Her father's decree had been clear. Gone by sunrise. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her slink away in the pale morning light. She would disappear into the night, a shadow swallowed by shadows. Taking a deep breath, she slung the satchel over her shoulder. She gave the den one last sweeping glance. This place, which had once been her sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The love had died here, and it was time to bury the corpse. Slipping past the leather flap was like breaking the surface of water after holding her breath for too long. The night air was cool and crisp, a welcome shock to her system. The moon was her only guide as she moved through the sleeping village, her feet silent on the packed earth. She didn't look back. Looking back meant acknowledging what she was losing, and she couldn't bear it. She had to focus on what lay ahead. The forest. The vast, dark expanse of the wilderness that marked the edge of their territory was both a threat and a promise. It was a place of predators and danger, but it was also a place where she could be truly alone, free from the judging eyes of her pack. She ran, not like a wolf, but as a girl. Pushing past the burn in her lungs and the ache in her legs, she plunged into the deep woods, the branches clawing at her like desperate hands, welcoming her into the unforgiving embrace of the unknown. Chapter 4. The Scent of Power. The forest was a relentless, vertical world. For hours, Audrey pushed herself onward, driven by a cold, hard knot of fury in her stomach. She climbed over moss-slicked logs, scrambled up steep, muddy inclines, and pushed through thickets of thorns that snagged her clothes and tore at her skin. The adrenaline that had fueled her initial escape had long since burned away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead. The sun began to filter through the dense canopy, painting the forest floor in stripes of pale gold, but it brought no warmth. She was far from the familiar paths now, in a part of the woods the pack patrollers rarely ventured. The trees were older here, bigger, their branches forming a dense roof that blocked out the sky. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and she finally allowed herself to stop, her back sliding down the rough bark of a massive pine. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She fumbled in her satchel for the bread and meat, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unwrap them. The food was tasteless in her mouth, but she forced herself to chew and swallow, knowing she needed the strength. As she drank from her water skin, the reality of her situation finally settled in, heavy and suffocating. She was alone, truly, utterly alone. No pack, no family, no future. A wave of despair washed over her, so potent it nearly drowned her. Her head fell back against the tree, and for the first time, she allowed the tears to come, silent and hot, tracking paths through the dirt on her cheeks. It was the scent that pulled her back from the edge. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable beneath the familiar smells of damp earth and decaying leaves. But it grew stronger, a current in the air that was utterly alien. It smelled of ozone after a lightning strike, of ancient stone, and of a raw, untamed power that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It was masculine, dominant, and it resonated with a part of her soul she didn't know existed. Her wolf, dormant and cowed by years of rejection, stirred within her, its head lifting, nostrils flaring. Fear, sharp and primal, cut through her exhaustion. This was not the scent of a silver moon wolf. It was something other, something older and far more dangerous. She scrambled to her feet, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of her knife. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a physical pressure against her skin. She scanned the dense undergrowth, her eyes darting between the shadows. And then she saw him. Not him, it. A wolf. But it was unlike any wolf she had ever seen. It was enormous, a beast of nightmare, its fur the color of jet and shadow. It stood perfectly still, almost invisible in the gloom, only its eyes visible. 2 points of molten gold that burned with a terrifying intelligence. They were fixed on her, and in their depths, she saw not hunger, but possession. Chapter 5. Claimed by Darkness. The massive black wolf took a step forward, and then another, moving with a silent, fluid grace that belied its incredible size. It circled her slowly, deliberately, its golden eyes never leaving hers. Audrey's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to shift and flee. But her body was frozen, pinned by the sheer weight of his presence. He was an apex predator, a king in his domain, and she was nothing more than a trespasser. The scent of him was overwhelming now, a heady mix of power, storm, and ancient forest that clouded her thoughts and sent a tremor of something other than fear through her. Her own wolf, which had been a source of shame for so long, was responding to him, a low, submissive whine caught in Audrey's throat. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He lowered his massive head, his nose almost touching her. She could see the fine muscles rippling beneath his dark pelt, the faint scar that cut through one eyebrow. He inhaled deeply, a sound that was both an inspection and a declaration, as if he were memorizing her very essence. Then, In a movement that was too quick for her to follow, the air shimmered around him. The form of the wolf dissolved, replaced by a man who was every bit as intimidating as the beast had been. He was tall, broader than any man in her pack, with shaggy, jet-black hair that fell to his shoulders. He was dressed in dark leather, practical and worn, and his skin was tanned from a life lived outdoors. But it was his face, his eyes, that held her captive. They were the same molten gold, burning with an intensity that stripped her bare. This was no ordinary rogue. This was an alpha. The power rolling off him in waves was suffocating, a palpable force that demanded submission. Audrey finally found her voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "Who are you? What do you want?" He took another step, closing the remaining distance between them. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, sending a jolt through her entire body. She flinched, but he didn't pull away. His gaze was unwavering, his expression one of absolute certainty. He didn't seem angry or threatening, but something far more terrifying, resolute. "I am Gideon," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that vibrated deep in her chest. "Alpha of the Blackwood Pack, and what I want," he paused, his thumb stroking softly against her cheek, "is you." His golden eyes darkened with a possessive fire that left no room for argument. "You are lost, little wolf, and you are mine." Chapter 6. The Alpha's Decree. The two words echoed in the silent forest, more binding than any law, more absolute than any ceremony. "You are mine." Audrey stared at him, her mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. She had spent her life being unwanted, and now this stranger, this terrifyingly powerful alpha, was claiming her as if she were a prize he had stumbled upon. A spark of her old defiance, the same stubborn pride that had kept her spine straight during the walk of shame, flared to life. "No," she breathed, the word barely audible. She took a half-step back, her hand tightening on the hilt of her knife. "I belong to the Silver Moon Pack. You can't just—" Gideon's expression didn't change, but an amused glint entered his golden eyes. "The pack that cast you out? The family that threw you into the wilderness to fend for yourself?" he asked, his voice calm, yet every word landed with surgical precision. "They surrendered any claim they had on you the moment they let you run. I saw you. I followed you. I watched you break. And I watched you get back up." He took a step forward for every one she took back, his presence seeming to shrink the forest around them. "That is strength. It is the kind of strength my pack needs. The kind of strength I need." He was in front of her again, his nearness stealing the air from her lungs. "You think this is a choice?" he murmured, his voice softening, but losing none of its authority. He gently took her hand, his large, warm palm easily enveloping her much smaller one, his thumb pressing over her racing pulse. He lifted it, ignoring the knife she still clutched. "The moon goddess is the one who chooses, little wolf. She led you to my territory. She put you in my path. I am merely obeying her will." The argument was so absurd, so arrogant, that it momentarily stunned her into silence. He was twisting fate to suit his own desires. And yet, when she looked into his eyes, she saw an unwavering conviction that chilled her to the bone. He truly believed it. He believed she was his. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a profound, weary sense of inevitability. From one prison to another, she had fled her family's judgment only to be ensnared by this alpha's decree. "Come," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. He released her hand and turned, expecting her to follow. "The sun will be setting soon, and my lands are still a long walk from here." Audrey stood frozen for a moment, her feet feeling rooted to the earth. She looked back in the direction she had come, towards a life of shame and rejection. Then she looked at the broad, formidable back of the man walking away from her. He was a monster, a kidnapper, a tyrant. But he was the first person in 5 years who had looked at her and seen something worth claiming. With a shuddering breath that felt like a surrender, she took the first step to follow him. Chapter 7. Journey to a New Kingdom. The journey was made in a tense, vibrating silence. Gideon moved through the forest with the ease of a creature born from its soil, his long strides covering the rough terrain effortlessly. Audrey, by contrast, had to scramble to keep up, her exhausted muscles screaming in protest. The landscape was changing, becoming wilder, more primal than the managed woods of the Silver Moon territory. The trees grew taller, their branches thicker, and the ground was a treacherous carpet of rocks and gnarled roots. Several times she stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose stone, and each time Gideon would pause, his head tilted as if listening, before continuing at a slightly slower pace. He never spoke, never looked back, but she knew he was acutely aware of her every faltering step. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the sun arcing across the sky and beginning its descent toward the jagged peaks of the mountains to the west. Gideon finally stopped at a small, clear stream and gestured for her to drink. Audrey knelt on the damp bank, cupping the icy water in her hands. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. As she drank, she watched him. He stood guard, his body relaxed but alert, his golden eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He was a warrior, a king in his element, and she was his prisoner. Yet, he hadn't bound her. He hadn't threatened her. A confusing mix of fear and a strange, nascent sense of security churned within her. He pulled a strip of dried meat from a pouch at his belt, far better quality than her own, and offered it to her. She took it hesitantly, their fingers brushing. The contact was brief, but it sent another jolt of awareness through her. She ate in silence, the tough, salty meat reviving her spirits more than she expected. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. Gideon finished his own portion of meat before answering, his gaze fixed on the darkening woods. "To Blackwood Keep, my home." "Your home," she repeated numbly. "And what am I to be there? Your slave? Your pet?" The bitterness she felt towards her family was spilling over, tainting her words with venom. He turned his head then, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "You will be my mate," he stated, as if it were the simplest, most obvious fact in the world. "You will be the Luna of the Blackwood Pack, and you will be respected as such." He said the words with such profound certainty that Audrey could find no response. The title was so far beyond anything she had ever imagined for herself that it sounded like a foreign language. Luna, her, who had been deemed unworthy of even the lowest-ranking warrior. The idea was so preposterous it was almost laughable. Almost. But looking at the deadly serious expression on the face of the Alpha King, she didn't feel like laughing at all. Chapter 8. The Den of the Feared. As twilight bled across the sky, they crested a final steep ridge. Below them, nestled in a valley carved from the mountain's granite heart, was Blackwood Keep. It was nothing like the sprawling, open village of her home pack. This was a fortress. A formidable wall of sharpened logs, at least 20 feet high, encircled the settlement. A single, heavily guarded gate was the only visible entrance. Within the walls, the dens were not individual huts, but structures built into the very stone of the valley. Their entrances dark mouths in the rock face, smoke curling from hidden chimneys. It was a place built for survival, for war. A place designed to keep the world out. As they approached the gate, 2 guards, both bearing the scars of past battles, snapped to attention. Their eyes widened slightly at the sight of Audrey, but they spoke only to their alpha. "Alpha Gideon, your return is welcome." Their voices were rough, filled with a deference that bordered on reverence. "Open the gate, Silas," Gideon commanded. The gate swung inward with a heavy groan, and they stepped inside. If the exterior was intimidating, the interior was alive with a fierce, raw energy. The central clearing was filled with pack members. They were bigger than the wolves of her pack, tougher. Men and women alike bore scars with pride, their gazes sharp and assessing. The moment Gideon entered with her, a hush fell over the entire compound. All activity ceased. Every pair of eyes, curious, hostile, wary, fixed on her. She felt like a lamb being paraded through a den of lions. She instinctively moved closer to Gideon's side, the heat from his body a strange, anchoring presence in the sea of hostile stares. A man even broader than Gideon, with a thick gray-streaked beard and a calm, intelligent face, stepped forward. He bowed his head slightly. Alpha. Kale, Gideon acknowledged. My beta. His eyes swept over the silent pack. His voice rang out, clear and absolute, leaving no room for questions. This is Audrey. She is with me. She will be treated with the same respect you give your Luna, because that is what she is to be. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Audrey could feel the shock, the disbelief, the outright hostility from some. She risked a glance at the wolves around her and saw a young, brutish-looking male with cold eyes sneering openly in her direction. Her stomach twisted in knots. This was not a welcome. This was a challenge. Gideon had not brought her to a new home. He had thrown her into a new battlefield, and she was completely, terrifyingly unprepared for the fight. Chapter 9. A Gilded Cage. Gideon ignored the whispers of his pack, his focus solely on Audrey. He placed a large, firm hand on the small of her back, a gesture that was both possessive and oddly reassuring, and guided her away from the crowded clearing. He led her towards the largest of the dens, one carved into the base of the sheer cliff face that formed the back of the valley. The entrance was flanked by two stoic guards who bowed their heads as they passed. Inside, the den was a world away from the harsh exterior of the keep. It was spacious and warm, lit by the soft glow of several well-placed lanterns. Thick, dark furs covered the floor and were draped over large, roughly carved wooden furniture. A fire crackled merrily in a massive stone hearth, its warmth chasing away the night's chill. A table was laden with roasted meat, fresh bread, and a pitcher of what smelled like spiced wine. It was more luxurious than any den she had ever been in, including her father's as Beta. But the comfort did nothing to ease the frantic beating of her heart. It felt like a trap, a beautifully decorated cage. "This will be your home now," Gideon said, his voice softer in the confines of the den. He gestured to a heavy wooden door off the main chamber. "That is your room. You will not be disturbed." He watched her, his golden eyes searching her face. "You are safe here, Audrey. No one will harm you." The promise of safety, something she had craved for years, now felt like a threat. Safe, but a prisoner. She finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and let the fear and anger show in her eyes. "And what if I don't want to be safe here? What if I want to leave?" His expression tightened, the softness vanishing. "Then you will find the world outside these walls is far less merciful than I am. You belong here now. With me." He didn't raise his voice, but the finality in his tone was absolute. There was no escape. "Eat," he commanded, his voice gentler again. "Rest. We will speak more in the morning." With that, he turned and left, the heavy leather flap falling shut behind him, leaving her alone in the roaring silence. Audrey didn't move towards the food. She walked to the closed door he had indicated and pushed it open. The room beyond was just as comfortable, with a large bed piled high with furs and a small window cut high into the rock, covered by a thick hide. She walked over to it and pushed the hide aside. The window was too high and too small to climb through. It offered only a sliver of the moonlit sky. She let the hide fall back into place, plunging the room into darkness. He had given her a comfortable bed, a warm fire, and good food. But he had also given her walls, guards, and a window with no view of escape. It was a cage, no matter how gilded. Chapter 10. Whispers in the Shadows. For 2 days, Audrey lived in the gilded cage of Gideon's den. She was a ghost, haunting the warm, firelit spaces, feeling utterly disconnected from the world outside. A stern-faced, older she-wolf named Mara brought her meals 3 times a day. Mara never spoke, simply setting down the tray of food, her eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts, before departing as silently as she came. The solitude was a strange torture. It gave her too much time to think, to cycle through fear, anger, and a bewildering sense of loss for a life she hadn't even wanted. On the 3rd day, she couldn't stand it any longer. She needed to see the sky, to breathe air that wasn't heavy with the scent of wood smoke and another's territory. Hesitantly, she pushed aside the entrance flap and stepped out. The guards stationed there tensed, but made no move to stop her, their orders apparently clear. The keep was a hive of activity. She watched from the shadows of the overhang as warriors trained in the central yard, their movements brutal and efficient, a far cry from the more ritualized sparring of her old pack. She saw she-wolves tanning hides and sharpening blades, their hands as calloused and capable as the males. This was a pack forged in hardship, a collective of survivors. There was a grim purposefulness to them that both intimidated and fascinated her. She began to piece together the nature of Gideon's rule through overheard scraps of conversation. They spoke of him with a mixture of awe and terror. He was ruthless, unyielding, a king who demanded absolute loyalty. But they also spoke of how he had saved them. Many, she gathered, were outcasts like her, wolves from other packs who had been exiled, orphaned, or had fled persecution. Gideon had gathered the unwanted, the broken, and the dangerous, and forged them into a weapon, a family bound not by blood, but by their shared survival under his iron-fisted protection. He was feared by the other packs because he had built his strength from their cast-offs. Her observations were interrupted by a low, contemptuous voice. "Enjoying the view, Stray?" Audrey turned to see the brutish young wolf who had sneered at her on her first night. He was flanked by 2 others, his arms crossed over his chest, a smirk on his face. "My name is Audrey," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know what your name is," he scoffed. "Fenris. And I think the Alpha has lost his mind, bringing a weak, unclaimed little thing like you into our midst. You smell of fear and weakness. You don't belong here." He took a menacing step closer, his cronies fanning out. "Whatever spell you cast on him, it won't work on the rest of us." Before Audrey could respond, a shadow fell over them. "Is there a problem, Fenris?" Gideon's voice was deceptively soft, but it cut through the air like a blade. Fenris and his friends froze, their bravado vanishing instantly. They turned, their expressions shifting to ones of pure fear. Gideon hadn't raised his voice, but the raw power radiating from him was more threatening than any shout. He stood behind Audrey, a silent, lethal protector. He looked at Fenris, and for the first time, Audrey understood why they called him the feared Alpha. Chapter 11. The feared Alpha's wrath. The shift in the training yard was instantaneous. The moment Gideon spoke, all sparring ceased, all conversations died. The only sound was the crackle of the central fire and the wind whistling over the palisade. Fenris, who had seemed so confident moments before, was now trembling, his face pale. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Gideon to his friends, who had already taken a step back, subtly disassociating themselves from him. "No, Alpha," Fenris stammered, his voice losing all its earlier bravado. "Just welcoming the newcomer." Gideon took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving to stand beside Audrey. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the furnace-like heat of his body, the thrum of his barely contained power. His golden eyes were fixed on Fenris, and they were utterly devoid of warmth. "Is that what you call it? Welcoming?" His voice was still quiet, a low growl that vibrated in the air. "It looked to me like you were questioning my judgment. It looked to me," he continued, taking another step, forcing Fenris to stumble backward, "like you were disrespecting your future Luna." Every pack member in the yard was now watching, their faces a mixture of fear and grim fascination. This was a lesson, and Fenris was the example. I would never, Alpha," Fenris pleaded, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "You would, and you did," Gideon stated, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a lethal whisper. "My word is law here, Fenris. My choices are not for you to question. She is my choice. An attack on her is an attack on me. Disrespect to her is treason." He moved with impossible speed, his hand lashing out and grabbing Fenris by the throat. He lifted the larger male off the ground with one hand, his knuckles white. Fenris choked, his feet kicking uselessly in the air. "Let this be the only warning." Gideon's voice now boomed across the silent yard, directed at everyone watching. "She is to be protected. She is to be honored. Anyone who makes her feel unwelcome will answer directly to me. There will be no second chances." He held Fenris for a moment longer, his golden eyes burning with cold fire, before slamming him back onto the ground. Fenris crumpled in a heap, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat. Gideon didn't give him a second glance. He turned his back on the humiliated wolf, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his stunned pack. The message was brutally, unequivocally clear. Audrey was his, and his protection was absolute and terrifyingly violent. Chapter 12. The Weight of a Crown. Gideon's hand was on her back again, guiding her firmly back toward the den. Audrey moved woodenly, her mind reeling. The brutal efficiency of his actions had left her breathless. In her old pack, a dispute like that would have been handled with posturing, a formal challenge, perhaps a sanctioned fight. Gideon had dealt with it in seconds, with a display of raw power designed for maximum psychological impact. He hadn't just defeated Fenris, he had stripped him of his pride and turned him into a living warning for the entire pack. She felt sick to her stomach, and yet a small, treacherous part of her felt a thrill of security she had never known. No one had ever stood up for her like that. Inside the den, the warmth of the fire did nothing to thaw the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Gideon let the flap fall, shutting out the rest of the world. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. She expected him to be angry, to lecture her for causing trouble, but his eyes held a different emotion. It looked almost like regret. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice now stripped of the cold fury it held moments before. Audrey flinched. The question was so unexpected, so normal, that she didn't know how to answer. "You almost killed him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I didn't," he replied calmly. "He will heal. His pride will not. That was the point." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration that seemed out of character for the unshakable Alpha. "Audrey, you must understand. This pack is not like the one you knew. We are not bound by generations of blood and tradition. We are a pack of outcasts, of survivors. Each wolf here was broken in some way before they came to me. Strength, absolute and unquestionable, is the only thing that holds us together. Weakness, even a perceived moment of it, is an invitation for chaos." He closed the distance between them, his presence filling the room. "When I brought you here, I made you a symbol of my strength, my choice. Fenris was testing that. He was testing me. If I had shown leniency, others would have seen it as weakness. They would have challenged you, and through you, they would have challenged me. I did what I did not, just to protect you, but to protect the stability of this entire pack." He looked down at her, and for the first time she saw the immense burden he carried. He was not just a tyrant. He was a king holding a fragile nation together with the sheer force of his will. The crown he wore was a heavy one. "I do not enjoy ruling through fear," he said, his voice a low murmur. "But it is the only language some of my people understand. At least, for now." Chapter 13. An Unexpected Tutor. The following morning, Audrey was surprised when a knock came at her chamber door. It wasn't Mara with her food. When she opened it, she found Gideon's beta, Kale, standing there. His sheer size was intimidating, but his eyes, a calm, steady gray, held none of the hostility she'd seen in the others. He offered her a small, respectful nod. "Alpha Gideon asked me to see you," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly bass. "He believed you might benefit from understanding our ways, beyond yesterday's lesson." There was a hint of disapproval in his tone when he mentioned the incident, so subtle she almost missed it. "My name is Kale. I am the Alpha's beta and responsible for the training of our pack." Audrey stared at him, unsure of what to say. "Training?" she asked. "Training for what?" "To be Luna," he replied simply, as if it were obvious. "Here, that is not a passive role. The Silver Moon Pack values lineage and ceremony. We value survival and strength. Our Luna must be as strong as our Alpha, in her own way. She must understand our laws, our territory, our enemies. She must be able to command respect, not just have it demanded for her." The words struck a chord within her. For her entire life, she had been told she was weak, inadequate. The role of Luna in her home pack was to be a gentle diplomatic presence, to oversee the dens and raise strong pups. Kale was describing something else entirely, a position of genuine power and responsibility. It was a terrifying prospect, but it was also the first time anyone had suggested she was capable of being more than just a broodmare or a disgrace. I don't know how to do any of that," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The shame of her inadequacy was a familiar, bitter taste. A flicker of something that looked like sympathy crossed Kale's stoic face. "No one is born knowing," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But you can learn, if you are willing." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. This was a choice. Perhaps the first real one she'd had since fleeing her home. She could remain a pampered prisoner in Gideon's den, protected by his brutality, or she could take this chance to forge her own strength. "What would I have to do?" she asked, a spark of determination igniting within her. Kale allowed himself a small, rare smile. "First, you will learn the land. Then you will learn the blade. And finally, you will learn what it means to lead wolves who have forgotten how to follow anyone but the strongest among them. It will not be easy." He looked her over, his gaze assessing. "But the Alpha saw something in you, hidden in those woods. I have learned to trust his instincts. Now, let's see if we can show you what he saw. Your first lesson begins at noon. Meet me in the training yard." Chapter 14. The First Lesson. Promptly at noon, Audrey made her way to the training yard. The memory of Fenris's humiliation was still fresh, and the pack members who were there gave her a wide berth, their eyes a mixture of fear and newfound respect, not for her, but for the Alpha's wrath. Kale was waiting for her, standing near a rack of training weapons. He held 2 long wooden staffs. He tossed one to her, and she fumbled with it before getting a firm grip. It felt heavy and awkward in her hands. "Strength is not just about the body," Kale began, his voice calm and methodical. "It is about balance, about knowing your opponent and knowing yourself. Your weakness is not your fault. You were raised in a pack that values gentleness in its females. Here, that is a liability. We will turn it into a strength." He showed her a basic defensive stance, correcting her posture, the placement of her feet, the grip on her staff. His instructions were clear, concise, and devoid of judgment. He treated her not as a fragile female or a future Luna, but as a recruit who needed to learn. For the first time in a long time, Audrey felt like she was being seen for her potential, not for her past failures. "Now," he said, "I will attack. You will block." His first move was a slow, deliberate swing. Audrey, clumsy and panicked, barely managed to get her staff up in time, the wood clattering loudly. The impact vibrated up her arms, making her teeth ache. He came at her again and again, his movements patient and controlled, never striking with full force but always making her react. She was a mess of flailing limbs and panicked blocks. She stumbled, fell, and got back up, her muscles burning, her lungs screaming for air. A small crowd had gathered to watch, their whispers a low hum at the edge of her hearing. She could feel their derision, their doubt. After one particularly clumsy block, she tripped over her own feet and landed hard on the dusty ground, the staff flying from her grasp. A few of the onlookers snickered. Hot shame washed over her, and tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. She was making a fool of herself. "Get up," Cale said, his voice impassive. "I can't," she whispered, the humiliation too much to bear. "They're all laughing." Cale's gaze flickered to the crowd, and his expression hardened. But when he looked back at her, his voice was softer. "Let them laugh. Laughter is the weapon of those who are too afraid to try. You are here. You are trying. That already makes you stronger than them." He extended the end of his staff to her. "Now get up, Audrey. The lesson is not over." His words, simple and direct, cut through her shame. He was right. Quitting now would only prove them right. It would prove Fenris right. It would prove her family right. Gritting her teeth, she took the offered staff, pulled herself to her feet, and raised her weapon again, her knuckles white, but her resolve hardening into steel. Chapter 15. A Glimmer of Respect. For the rest of the week, Audrey's life fell into a new, grueling rhythm. Every morning, Mara would deliver her breakfast with the same stony silence. But now, instead of hiding in the den, Audrey would change into practical leather breeches and a tunic, left for her by Mara without comment, and head to the training yard. Cale was a relentless tutor. He drilled her in footwork until her legs felt like jelly and had her practice blocks until her arms were covered in a mosaic of bruises. Progress was slow, agonizingly so. She was still clumsy, still easily winded, but she was no longer hopeless. Each day she could hold her stance a little longer, her blocks felt a little more solid, and the snickers from the onlookers grew fewer. She learned to ignore the stares, to focus only on Cale's voice and the satisfying thud of wood against wood. She learned to embrace the burn in her muscles as a sign of growing strength, not weakness. One afternoon, as she was practicing a difficult parry, Cale surprised her by sweeping her legs out from under her. She landed flat on her back, the wind knocked out of her. Lying there, staring up at the sky, she didn't feel shame. She felt fury. Scrambling to her feet before Cale could even speak, she lunged at him, a wordless cry of frustration erupting from her throat. Her attack was sloppy, all aggression and no technique, but it was pure instinct. Cale easily disarmed her, pinning her against the weapon rack, the wooden staff pressed lightly against her throat. "Good," he said, and for the first time, his voice held a note of genuine praise. "Anger is a tool. You are learning to use it." He released her and stepped back. "That is enough for today." As Audrey stood there, catching her breath, she noticed a figure standing in the shadow of the main den's overhang. It was Gideon. She had no idea how long he had been watching. His face was unreadable, as always, but his eyes were fixed on her. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of possession or command. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of respect. The small gesture hit her with more force than any of Cale's blows. Her father, the beta of his pack, had never once looked at her with that expression. No one had. It was a validation not of her worth as a mate or as a Luna, but of her effort. It was a glimmer of respect she had earned entirely on her own, through sweat and bruises and a refusal to quit. As Gideon turned and disappeared back into his den, Audrey stood a little taller in the training yard, the heavy wooden staff in her hand suddenly feeling a little lighter. Chapter 16. The Alpha's Territory. The nod from Gideon had changed something. The bruises from training still ached, but the deep, internal sting of shame had begun to recede, replaced by a tender shoot of self-respect. She had earned that nod. In a world that had only judged her for what she lacked, she was finally building something of her own. She found herself meeting the gazes of other pack members not with defiance, but with a quiet confidence that was entirely new. The next morning, Gideon approached her as she finished her breakfast. "Your lessons with Kale teach you to fight," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But a Luna must be more than a warrior. Today your lesson is with me." Audrey simply nodded, a nervous flutter in her chest. She followed him out into the crisp morning air. As they walked toward the main gate, a familiar hush fell over the training yard. The whispers that followed them were no longer filled with contempt, but with a wary, curious respect. They passed through the gate and into the vast wilderness surrounding the keep. He led her up a steep trail that wound its way up the side of the mountain. When they finally reached the summit, Audrey gasped. Below them, the entire territory sprawled out like a map. The keep, a formidable stone heart nestled in the valley, and the silver ribbon of a river snaking through the dark woods. "This is my kingdom," Gideon said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. He pointed to a narrow pass between two peaks. "That is the only easy way in for an army. We watch it day and night." He then gestured to a series of lower hills. "The streams there run shallow in the summer. A weakness. We set traps there." He spoke to her not as an outsider, but as a strategist, explaining the land's strengths and vulnerabilities. He was showing her the soul of his territory, the tangible thing he was bound to protect. "Why are you telling me all this?" she finally asked, her voice soft. Gideon turned, his golden eyes serious. "Because a Luna does not simply live in the Alpha's territory. She is a part of it. She must know it as well as he does. Power isn't just in the strength of your warriors, but in the wisdom of your leaders." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the vast wilderness. "To protect this pack, you must love this land. You must understand why it is worth fighting for." Chapter 17. A Message from the Past. Several weeks passed. Audrey's lessons with Gideon and Kale became the cornerstones of her new life. With Kale, she learned the harsh poetry of combat, her body growing stronger, her movements more certain. With Gideon, she learned the intricate dance of leadership, studying the territory until she knew its secrets as well as he did. She began to sit in on his councils with Kale and the other senior warriors, listening silently as they discussed patrols, supplies, and the ever-present threat of rival packs. She was no longer just a prize to be protected. She was becoming a partner. The fear she once felt for Gideon had slowly, imperceptibly, transformed into a deep, abiding respect, and something more, something warmer that she was not yet ready to name. One evening, as they were finishing a council, a scout burst into the den, his face grim. "Alpha," he panted, bowing his head. "A patrol from the Silver Moon Pack was found at our southern border. They were not hostile. They carried a message." Audrey's blood ran cold. The name of her old pack, a name she had tried to bury, felt like a ghost in the room. Gideon's golden eyes immediately flickered to her, his expression unreadable but his attention absolute. "A message for whom?" Gideon asked, his voice calm. "For her, Alpha," the scout said, his gaze shifting nervously to Audrey. "For the daughter of Gregor. It seems word of her whereabouts has finally reached them." Kyle stepped forward and took the folded, sealed piece of hide from the scout. He handed it to Gideon, who looked at it for a long moment before holding it out to Audrey. His face was a mask of stone, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. The past she had fled so desperately had finally caught up to her. Her hand trembled as she took the message. The seal was her father's, the mark of the Beta of Silvermoon. With a deep, steadying breath, she broke it. The writing was her mother's, the script sharp and angry. It was not a plea for her return, nor was it an apology. It was a demand. The note explained that since word had spread of her shameful alliance with the feared Alpha of Blackwood, Alpha Marcus had declared her family a potential source of treason. They were to be evicted from their den, stripped of their rank, and cast out of the pack unless their wayward daughter returned to beg forgiveness and sever all ties with the enemy. Her family, the family that had thrown her away, was now using their fate to chain her once more. They were being threatened because of her, and now she was their only hope. Chapter 18. A King's Counsel. The piece of hide felt like a burning coal in Audrey's hand. The words swam before her eyes, each one a venomous dart of manipulation. Our fate rests with you. Only your obedience can save us. The hypocrisy was staggering. Her family had cast her out, declared her a blight, and now they demanded she sacrifice her new life to salvage the honor they themselves had deemed she didn't possess. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. Gideon watched her, his expression patient. He had dismissed the scout and Kyle, leaving the two of them alone in the main chamber, the crackling fire the only sound. He didn't rush her, didn't demand to know the contents of the message. He simply waited, giving her the space to process the emotional tidal wave that had just crashed over her. "They want me to come back," she said finally, her voice hollow. She summarized the contents of the letter, the threat of eviction, the demand that she sever all ties with Blackwood. "They threw me away, and now they want to use me as a bargaining chip to save themselves." The anger was a hot, familiar coil in her gut, but beneath it was a confusing swirl of guilt and a lingering, painful sense of duty. They were still her blood. "What do you want to do?" Gideon asked. His voice was quiet, carefully neutral. The question caught her off guard. She had expected a command, an opinion, a strategic analysis. She had expected him to forbid her from going, to declare her family's fate irrelevant. But he was asking for her decision. He was giving her a choice. "I don't know," she admitted, crumpling the message in her fist. "A part of me wants to let them burn. They deserve it. But they are your family," he finished for her, his tone understanding. He moved to stand before her, his large frame blocking out the rest of the room. "Audrey, when I found you, you were a survivor. Look at you now. You are a warrior, a leader. The choice you make now should not be dictated by the girl who was cast out, but by the woman you have become." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently unclench her fist, taking the crumpled note from her. He tossed it into the fire, where it instantly blackened and curled into ash. "Their power over you is gone. What happens next is entirely up to you." He was offering her counsel, not a command. He was treating her as his equal. He was showing her that her past did not define her future unless she allowed it to. The conflict inside her was immense, a war between the wounded daughter and the nascent Luna. But looking into Gideon's steady, golden eyes, she felt a sense of clarity. He would not make this choice for her, but he would stand by her, whichever path she took. Chapter 19. The Luna's Choice. Audrey spent the night by the fire, long after Gideon had retreated to his own chambers, leaving her to the solitude of her thoughts. The flames danced and hissed, casting flickering shadows on the walls, each one a memory of the life she had left behind. She remembered her father's cold eyes, her mother's bitter words, the suffocating weight of their disappointment. That pain was still there, a scar on her soul that would never fully fade. But as she stared into the embers, she also saw Kale's patient instruction, the grudging respect in the eyes of the Blackwood warriors, and the unwavering belief in Gideon's gaze. She had been forged in the fire of her rejection, and she had emerged stronger, harder, and more resilient than she had ever imagined possible. The girl who had fled into the woods would have been crippled by this choice. She would have been torn apart by guilt and a desperate, pathetic need for her family's approval. But she was not that girl anymore. She was the future Luna of the Blackwood pack. She was a woman who knew her own worth, a worth that was not determined by a mate's claim or her family's status, but by her own strength and spirit. Her decision, when it finally solidified in the quiet hours before dawn, was not born from a sense of daughterly duty or a desire to win back their love. It was a strategic choice, a queen's choice. To ignore the message would be to show fear, to let her old pack think they still held some power over her, and by extension, over Gideon. To go back begging, as they demanded, was unthinkable. It would be a betrayal of everything she had become. But to go back on her own terms? That was an opportunity. It was a chance to confront her past not as a victim, but as a victor. When Gideon entered the main chamber at sunrise, he found her waiting, dressed not in her training leathers, but in a simple dark tunic that was practical, yet dignified. Her hair was braided back, and the wooden training staff rested against the wall beside her. Her eyes were clear, her expression resolute. "I have made my decision," she said, her voice calm and steady. Gideon stopped, his gaze searching hers. He simply waited, his hands clasped behind his back. "I will go back," she stated. "Not to beg and not to sever ties. I will go back to offer them a deal. My family's safety in exchange for their allegiance. They will see that the daughter they cast out is now their only hope for survival, and that her power comes from the very alliance they want her to break." She picked up her staff, the wood smooth and familiar in her hand. "I will not be their pawn. I will be their queen." A small, hard smile touched her lips. "And you, my alpha, will be at my side." Chapter 20. Return to Silvermoon. The journey back was the reverse of her desperate flight, but it felt like a lifetime had passed. Instead of running alone through the darkness, she rode at the head of a small, formidable procession. Gideon was beside her, his presence a silent declaration of power. Kale and a dozen of Blackwood's most elite warriors followed, their faces grim and their hands never far from the hilts of their weapons. They were not an invading army, but they were an undeniable statement. Audrey was not returning as a supplicant. She was returning as a visiting power. As they crossed the invisible border into Silvermoon territory, the air itself seemed to change. The woods were more open, less wild, and the familiar sense of her childhood home filled her with a strange mix of nostalgia and dread. It wasn't long before they were met by a patrol. The warriors' eyes widened in shock and fear when they recognized her, and even more so when they saw the infamous Alpha of Blackwood at her side. One of them quickly turned and ran back toward the village to sound the alarm. By the time they reached the main clearing, the entire Silvermoon pack was assembled, their faces a sea of confusion, fear, and disbelief. They parted before the Blackwood delegation, the silence heavy and absolute. Audrey scanned the crowd, her gaze cool and detached. She saw the faces of those who had pitied her, scorned her, and ignored her. Now, they couldn't look away. She found her family standing near the Alpha's boulder. Her father, Gregor, looked older, his face etched with worry. Her mother, Elspeth, was pale, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. When their eyes met Audrey's, she saw not love or relief, but shock and a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear. They did not see their daughter. They saw the Luna of their most feared enemy. Alpha Marcus stood on the great boulder, his expression a mask of fury and disbelief. "Audrey," he boomed, his voice tight with rage. "You dare to bring this butcher to our lands? Have you lost your mind?" Audrey dismounted smoothly, her movements confident and sure. She did not flinch under his glare. Gideon and his warriors remained mounted, a silent, menacing backdrop. She walked forward, stopping at the base of the boulder, and looked up at the alpha who had presided over her humiliation. "I have not lost my mind, Alpha Marcus," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent clearing. "I have found my strength. I received a message that my family was in danger because of my choices. I have returned not to beg, but to offer you a choice of your own." Chapter 21. A Daughter's Strength, a Father's Shame. Alpha. Marcus stared down at her, his face purpling with rage. "A choice? You, the unclaimed, the outcast, dare to offer me a choice?" His voice was a roar meant to intimidate, to remind her of her former place. But the words no longer had any power over her. They were the desperate bluster of a man who was quickly losing control of the situation. "Yes," Audrey replied, her voice unwavering. "I do." She turned her gaze from the alpha to her parents. "You used your own safety to try and manipulate me. You blamed me for the consequences of your own cruelty." She looked directly at her father. "You cast me out to protect your rank, and in doing so, you have nearly lost everything. Your position as beta is meaningless if you have no home, no pack." Gregor flinched as if struck, his face a mask of shame. Her mother, Elspeth, simply stared, her mouth agape, unable to comprehend the powerful, confident woman standing before her. This was not the broken child she had sent into the woods. "The Blackwood pack is strong," Audrey continued, her voice resonating with authority. "Stronger than you know. We are a pack of survivors, forged in the fires you and other alphas like you created with your petty rules of bloodlines and worth. We have the strength to crush you, or the strength to be a powerful ally." She let that statement hang in the air, allowing the weight of it to settle over the stunned Silvermoon pack. "This is your choice, Alpha Marcus," she said, turning her attention back to him. "You can follow through on your threat. You can cast out my family, make yourselves my enemy, and in doing so, make an enemy of the Blackwood pack. We will not stand by and allow my blood to be made homeless because of your pride. An attack on them is an attack on me." She paused, letting the echo of Gideon's words to Fenris fill the clearing. "Or you can restore my family to their position, and in return, the Blackwood pack will offer an alliance. A treaty of mutual protection. Your pack is weakening. You have had trouble with rogues on your eastern border for months. We can help you." She was not asking. She was stating the terms. She had taken their threat and turned it into a negotiation where she held all the power. Gideon watched from his horse, his expression unreadable, but a fierce pride burned in his golden eyes. This was the queen he had seen hiding within the broken girl in the forest. Chapter 22. An Alliance Forged in Fire. Alpha Marcus was trapped. Audrey could see it in the frantic workings of his expression. His pride warred with his pragmatism, his anger with his fear. To his left stood the daughter of his beta, a girl his pack had deemed worthless, now poised and powerful, backed by the most feared alpha in the region. To his right stood that very alpha, Gideon, whose silent, imposing form was a far more potent threat than any of Audrey's words. The dozen Blackwood warriors behind him were a living testament to the brutal strength Marcus knew his own pack could not match. He was a proud alpha, but he was not a stupid one. He knew Audrey was right about the rogues. They had been a thorn in his side for months, preying on patrols and stealing game. His warriors were stretched thin. An alliance with Blackwood, once an unthinkable proposition, now presented itself as a lifeline. But the cost was immense. His pride. He would have to admit that this unclaimed girl held the fate of his pack in her hands. "An alliance?" he scoffed, trying to regain some semblance of control. "What guarantee do we have that your Alpha will honor such a treaty? He is known for breaking packs, not mending them." It was Gideon who answered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that sent a shiver through the crowd. "You have my word, and you have my Luna's word." He dismounted, walking to stand beside Audrey, placing a hand on her shoulder. The gesture was one of possession, partnership, and absolute unity. "The Silver Moon Pack will be under our protection. Any who attack it will face the full wrath of Blackwood." But his golden eyes narrowed. "This protection is contingent on the safety and respect of my Luna's family. If any harm comes to them, from you or anyone else, this treaty is void, and you will be left to face your enemies alone." The threat was clear, the terms non-negotiable. Marcus looked from Gideon's implacable face to Audrey's resolute one. He saw the truth. He was outmaneuvered. With a low growl of frustration that was an admission of defeat, he gave a stiff, formal nod. "Fine," he bit out. "The treaty is accepted. Gregor and his family will retain their rank and den." A collective sigh of relief went through the Silver Moon Pack. They had been on the brink of a war they could not win, and Audrey had saved them. She looked at her parents. Her mother was weeping silently, a mixture of relief and shame. Her father, Gregor, met her gaze for a long moment. He didn't speak, but for the first time in her life, she saw not disappointment in his eyes, but a flicker of awe. He slowly, stiffly, bowed his head. It was not the bow of a father to a daughter, but of a beta to a Luna. In that moment, Audrey knew she had truly won. Chapter 23. The Journey Home. The ride back to Blackwood Keep was profoundly different from the journey out. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled sense of victory. Audrey rode beside Gideon, no longer as his captive or his student, but as his partner, his equal. She had faced the ghosts of her past and had not just survived, she had triumphed. She had rewritten her own narrative, transforming her greatest shame into her greatest source of power. As they rode, she found herself thinking not of her family's grudging respect, but of the Blackwood Pack, her home. It was a pack of outcasts, of broken souls Gideon had forged into a family. She was one of them. She understood them. Her rejection was not a weakness. It was the very thing that qualified her to lead them. It was the source of her empathy and her strength. They stopped to rest by a stream as the sun began to set, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. While the warriors tended to the horses, Gideon led Audrey a short distance away, to a small clearing overlooking the valley. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice a low, sincere murmur. He stood close, his warmth a comforting presence against the evening chill. "I only did what you taught me," she replied, looking up at him. "You showed me what strength was." "No, Audrey," he corrected gently, his golden eyes soft in the fading light. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "I only helped you find the strength that was already there. I saw it in you from the moment I found you in the woods, a fire that all of their scorn could not extinguish." The tenderness in his touch, the raw sincerity in his voice, melted the final wall around her heart. The fear was long gone, replaced by a deep and powerful affection she could no longer deny. This formidable alpha, this feared king, was the only one who had ever seen her, truly seen her. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender that was also a declaration. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of possession or dominance, but of reverence and a shared understanding. It was a kiss that sealed their alliance, their partnership, and the unspoken promise of a future together. It was the gentle claiming of two souls who had been broken by the world and had found their home in each other. In the heart of the wilderness, under the watchful eyes of the moon, the rejected girl and the feared alpha were finally, completely, bound together. Chapter 24. Queen of the Outcasts. Returning to Blackwood Keep felt like a true homecoming. As Audrey and Gideon rode through the gates, the entire pack was there to greet them. But this time, the eyes that watched her were not filled with suspicion or hostility. They were filled with awe. News of her confrontation with the Silver Moon Pack had traveled faster than they had. They had heard how she had faced down an alpha, how she had single-handedly forged an alliance and secured her family's safety through sheer force of will. She had proven she was more than just the alpha's choice. She was a leader in her own right. As she dismounted, Fenris, the warrior who had once scorned her, stepped forward. He stopped before her and bowed his head low, a gesture of profound, earned respect. "Luna," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "we welcome you home." One by one, the other pack members followed his lead, a sea of bowing heads and murmured greetings. They were not just accepting her, they were embracing her. In the weeks and months that followed, Audrey truly came into her power. She trained with Kale, her skill with the staff becoming a fluid dance of deadly grace. She stood beside Gideon as he ruled, her counsel proving to be as wise and strategic as his. But her true strength lay in her connection to the pack. She sought out the newest members, the most broken and fearful outcasts, and saw the same pain in their eyes that she had once seen in her own. She listened to their stories, helped them find their purpose, and showed them that their scars were not marks of shame, but symbols of their survival. She was not a gentle, distant Luna of tradition. She was a queen forged in the heart of their shared experience. She was the queen of the outcasts. One evening, she stood with Gideon on the overlook where he had first shown her the territory. They looked down at the keep, a beacon of light and warmth in the valley, a sanctuary for all the wolves the world had thrown away. "You have changed them," Gideon said, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. "You have taught them to hope again." Audrey leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of peace settling deep within her soul. "And you," she said softly, "taught me that being rejected was not an end. It was a beginning." She was no longer the girl who had prayed to be chosen. She was the woman who had chosen herself, who had built a home from the ashes of her pain, and who had found a love powerful enough to heal not just her own heart, but the heart of an entire pack.